$20,000 in debt sounds like a lot, and I'm not going to lie to you, it kind of is. But it's also probably not the financial death sentence that it feels like right now. For most people drowning in 20 grand, the problem isn't that the number is impossible to overcome. It's that they don't actually know where to start, and they're too ashamed to ask. They see the debt, and they panic. They make random payments here and there. They take out more debt to pay off the old debt, and somehow the number just keeps growing. It becomes this thing they don't want to look at. They avoid opening statements. They stop answering creditor calls. So if that's you, if you're sitting there staring at statements that make your stomach turn, we need to talk about what you're actually going to do about it. Because doing nothing is basically guaranteed to make things worse. But having a plan, even an imperfect one, changes everything. The first thing you need to understand about $20,000 in debt is that it's probably worse than you think. At least in terms of what it's actually costing you. If you've got credit cards sitting at 19, 20, even 25% interest, which is unfortunately pretty standard, you're not just paying off principal. You're hemorrhaging money to interest every single month. On a $20,000 credit card balance, at 20% interest, you're looking at roughly $400 a month just going to interest before you pay down a single dollar of the actual debt. That's almost $5,000 a year that's just vanishing. If you make minimum payments on that card, you might pay $200 a month, which means $100 of that is going to interest, and $100 is actually reducing the principal. At that rate, it would take you somewhere around 10 years to pay it off, and you'd end up paying more in interest than the original debt itself. So the real cost of carrying $20,000 in debt isn't $20,000. It's potentially $30, $40, even $50,000 when you factor in the years of interest you'll pay. Now, the second thing you need to understand is that how you got into this debt probably matters less than you think. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe you had medical bills. Maybe you just made some bad decisions and spent money you didn't have. Maybe you went through a divorce or got hit with unexpected expenses. Whatever happened, you're here now. Blaming yourself endlessly is not actually a useful strategy. What matters is what you do from this point forward. So stop spiraling about how you got here and start thinking about how you're going to get out. The absolute first thing you need to do is stop the bleeding. And I don't mean just stop spending money on stupid stuff, though yes, you probably need to do that too. I mean, you need to immediately assess your interest rates and start treating high interest debt like it's on fire, because it is. If you have $20,000 spread across multiple credit cards, student loans, car loans, personal loans, whatever, you need to know exactly what you're paying in interest on each one. Some debts are worse than others. A credit card at 23% is actively destroying your finances. A student loan at 4% is annoying but manageable. A car loan at 6% is somewhere in between. You need to know which debts are the real enemies here. Once you've mapped out your interest rates, you need to consider a balance transfer. If you've got good credit, you might be able to transfer high-interest credit card debt to a zero-interest balance transfer card, usually for a period of 6 to 21 months. Yeah, there's typically a transfer fee of 3 to 5%, but if you're paying 20% interest, saving on that interest is worth the fee. However, and this is important, a balance transfer only works if you actually have good credit. If your credit is already damaged from missed payments or too much utilization, this option might not be available. In that case, you need to look at debt consolidation, which is basically taking out one larger loan at a lower interest rate and using it to pay off multiple smaller debts. This can work, but you need to be careful because consolidation loans sometimes trap you into longer terms, where you end up paying more total interest even if the monthly rate is lower. The third critical thing is that you need to actually make a payment plan and commit to it. This is where most people fail. They know they need to pay off debt, they feel bad about it, they make a random large payment when they get their tax refund, and then they stop thinking about it again. That's not a plan. A real plan looks like this. You're going to pay a set amount every single month, and you're going to do this until the debt is gone. The question is how much you pay and in what order. There are two main strategies here. The first is the avalanche method, which is the mathematically optimal approach. You pay minimum payments on everything, and then every extra dollar you can squeeze out goes toward the debt with the highest interest rate first. Once that's paid off, you take what you were paying toward it and move to the next highest interest rate. This saves you the most money overall in interest. The second is the snowball method, which is the psychologically optimal approach. You pay minimum payments on everything except the smallest debt, and you throw everything you can at that smallest balance. Once it's gone, you get that psychological win, and you apply that same payment amount to the next smallest debt. The snowball takes longer and costs more in interest, but the psychological boost of actually eliminating a debt entirely motivates some people way more than slowly grinding down one large balance. Honestly, I'd recommend the avalanche method if you can stick to it, because saving $5,000 to $10,000 in interest is a massive difference. But if you absolutely know yourself well enough to realize that you need the psychological wins, the snowball isn't a horrible choice. It's not optimal, but it's way better than doing nothing. Now, here's where a lot of people go wrong. They assume that paying off debt is just a math problem. You figure out what to pay, you pay it, and boom, you're done. But debt isn't really about math. Debt is about behavior. You got into $20,000 of debt because of patterns. Maybe you use credit cards when you're stressed. Maybe you don't actually track spending. Maybe you don't have an emergency fund, so when something goes wrong, you immediately go into debt. Maybe you just had no idea how much things actually cost. Whatever the pattern is, if you don't fix it, you're going to end up right back here in 5 years. So while you're paying off the debt, you also need to simultaneously build an emergency fund. I know this sounds counterintuitive. You're drowning in debt, and I'm telling you to save money. But here's the thing. If you don't have any emergency savings, then the moment your car breaks down or you get a medical bill, you're going straight back to the credit card. You'll derail your debt payoff plan. So you need to save something, even if it's just $1,000. Get that $1,000 in the bank and keep it there for emergencies. After you've got the $1,000, you can redirect more aggressively to debt payoff. You also need to audit your spending and cut anything that isn't essential. And I don't mean stop having a life. I mean cut subscriptions you don't use, reduce restaurant spending, stop buying stuff you don't need. The goal is to free up as much money as possible every month to throw at the debt. If you can cut $500 a month from your spending, that's a massive accelerant on your payoff timeline. At $500 extra per month, $20,000 becomes a 4-year problem instead of a 10-year problem. That's the difference between having a debt hanging over your head for your entire 20s or 30s versus actually having a definite endpoint. One thing that catches a lot of people is that they try to fix everything at once. They cut all spending, they try to pay maximum amounts, they stress themselves out, and within 2 months they're back to their old patterns because it was unsustainable. The key is to make changes that you can actually stick with. If you cut your restaurant spending from $500 to $0 overnight, you'll fail. But if you cut it from $500 to $300, you can probably make that work. You're looking for sustainable, not perfect. Also, do not take on new debt while you're paying off this debt. I know sometimes you think you need to, but you don't. If you're in $20,000 of debt and you take out a new car loan or run up a new credit card, you're just making the hole deeper. The only exception is if you have a legitimate emergency that you absolutely cannot avoid, in which case you take the smallest debt possible and you immediately prioritize paying it off. But otherwise, new debt is off the table. The fourth major thing is that you need to get serious about income. I know this isn't what most debt payoff advice tells you. Most advice says cut spending, cut spending, cut spending. But here's the reality. If you're making $30,000 a year and you cut your spending by $500 a month, that's helpful, but it's also almost 20% of your income. That's brutal. If you're making 100,000 a year and you cut 500, that's manageable. The easiest path out of debt is often increasing income, not just decreasing spending. Can you get a raise at your current job? Can you pick up a side gig for a few hours a week? Can you sell stuff you don't need? During the payoff period, treating extra income as debt payoff money is incredibly powerful. An extra $1,000 a month from side work could eliminate your entire debt in less than 2 years. Finally, you need to understand that becoming debt-free is actually the easy part compared to staying debt-free. Once you've paid off this $20,000, you need to change the underlying behavior that created it. That means building a real budget, tracking spending, maintaining an emergency fund, and most importantly, using cash or debit instead of credit. The credit card that got you into this mess is not your friend. Even after you pay off the balance, a lot of people keep the card open and run it back up. Then they're paying off debt while simultaneously creating new debt, which is a trap that's nearly impossible to escape. The bottom line is this: 20,000 in debt is serious, but it's also solvable. You need to understand your interest rates. You need to stop the bleeding with a consolidation or transfer if possible. You need to make a real payment plan and stick to it. You need to fix the spending patterns that got you here, and you need to increase income where you can. Is this easy? No. Will it require sacrifice? Absolutely. But every month you stick to the plan, you're getting closer. Every extra payment you make is directly reducing the months and years you spend in debt. And there will be an end point. You will be out of debt. It just requires actually committing to the process instead of hoping it magically resolves itself. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.